Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty. This is the Fast Friday edition of the show for March 11th, 2022. And on this episode, I've got the fifth of a series covering the papers of one of the most prominent anti-federalist writers, Cato. And here in his fifth paper, Cato reiterates some issues that he has with the structure of the executive branch, warning that it would turn into some form of an elective or other form of monarchy. He then moves on to reject claims that a free people would never let their government just evolve into tyranny and that we should just kind of trust the people and the system. And then he rips into the entirety of the structure of Congress. And overall, he warns that the system will not, quote, prevent the unbridled ambition of a bad man. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow us. It's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And there you're going to find all the archives of the show. On individual episodes, you'll find links and references to stuff that I mentioned so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. You can also find all the different platforms we're on. We're on a bunch of video platforms and a bunch of audio-only podcast platforms. And you can even find our membership program where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. Again, the show homepage is 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I couldn't be more grateful for you spending some of your time with me today. Thank you so much for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But since it's Fast Friday, I promise to not take up too much of your time. Let's see if I can get this info out to you in the next 10 to 15 minutes. And I want to start out for this episode with Jason Mandrisch over at Founder of the Day, where he does a lot of great short blogs and overviews of anti-federalists and federalists alike and old revolutionaries. And here he puts it this way. In Cato number 5, an anti-federalist author completes his discussion of the presidency and moves on to criticize both houses of Congress. He begins the paper with a recounting of the problems with the presidency as he discussed in previous essays. Basically, he says the powers of the presidency are too ill-defined. You have to be very specific in how you're defining powers, otherwise someone with power is going to basically use those vague definitions to expand their own power. It's always going to play out like that. We've seen this all across the board. He says, what's going to happen from this, basically, is you're going to get human nature. That is a lust for power, and eventually something that's not much different than an elected monarchy. Here from Cato number 5, he puts it this way, and this was published November 22nd, 1787. He says, the progress of a commercial society begets luxury, the parent of inequality, the foe to virtue, and the enemy to restraint. And that ambition and voluptuousness, aided by flattery, will teach magistrates, where limits are not explicitly fixed, to have separate and distinct interests from the people. So if you're just saying the executive power is vested in this dude, and you're not completely specific about what that means, he's warning that the more powerful and the more rich and the less that the people have to watch over the government or they think they do because they're living a more comfortable life and things are good and they're able to do the things that humans want to do, that is live a life with their family, pursue their goals and their interests, and they're not necessarily watching over who's oppressing them. And then you're going to end up in a situation where you've got someone who eventually oppresses them. And I think that's kind of an interesting twist. Here, back to Jason Mandrisch, he says, Cato then responds to the Federalist argument that Americans are by nature a free people and would never let tyranny come to the United States. There was an argument that on the Federalist side that basically said, okay, yeah, maybe you've got some points about some problems here, but this is a free people. This is America, and we don't have to worry about things going bad. It can't happen here. We've heard that kind of thing for so many years. This was a very common Federalist argument. Basically, they were structuring the system in a way that the good people would rise to the top. And of course, it was structured in a way that the Federalist supporters were going to rise to the top, and then everything was going to be cool. A good example of that very common approach is George Nicholas, who the following summer in the Virginia Ratifying Convention generation was debating similar things with Patrick Henry in June of 1788. He put it this way: an enlightened people will never suffer what was established for their security to be perverted to an act of tyranny. And I actually agree with him. But Brutus is actually concerned not just for the short term, because you only know if the people are going to be enlightened. If you live amongst an enlightened people, you only know that's going to last for the time of your life or the time of that generation. What's going to happen in the future? Here's how Tara Ross, she puts it this way: Cato was unimpressed by claims that Americans will always prevent encroachments upon their liberty. Quote, she quotes him, he says, "You must recollect that opinion and manners are mutable and may not always be a permanent obstruction against the encroachments of government." So you can't just rely, even though the way to keep a government in check is by people not allowing it to get out of check, well, what happens? You're going to have less likelihood of that if you're less vague in the powers that are delegated, or you have more defined limits, less centralization or consolidation of power. And interestingly enough, Benjamin Franklin, a very strong Federalist, on the last day of the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitutional Convention, September 17th, 1787, he's basically urging everyone to unanimously support the document. He's saying he supports it, although there are many parts of it that he doesn't like. And he warns, he says, this is basically the same message that we're getting here from the Federalist side. He said, this is likely to be well administered for a course of years. It's going to go well and can only end in despotism, as other forms have done before it, when the people shall become so corrupted as to need despotic government, being incapable of any other. So this type of view is not exclusive to anti-federalist writers like Cato, Brutus. It wasn't exclusive to Patrick Henry. Even Benjamin Franklin was just saying, hey, look, it doesn't matter what structure you have. When you get bad people, or bad people in office, or the people themselves are corrupt, it doesn't matter what you've set up. Eventually, things are going to turn to despotism. And Benjamin Franklin gave that same warning. Back to Cato. He says, is it because he's asking this question? It's about this "it can't happen here" mentality, which I think a lot of people think is just more recent, but this goes all the way back to the time of the founding. He says, is it because you do not believe that an American can be a tyrant? Is it because you do not believe that an American can be a tyrant? That's such a great question. And he was asking this in November of 1787. He says, if this be the case, you rest on a weak basis. Americans are like other men in similar situations. And this was something that the founding generation really tried to hold on to. And before this period, I would say both sides of this question were really on the same side. If you had a similar situation, if you had a similar structure and similar scenarios, you can expect similar outcomes. So if you allow government to have power that it can define for itself, it's going to always expand this. And that's exactly what Cato is saying. He says, if this be the case, you rest on a weak basis. Americans are like other men in similar situations. When the manners and opinions of the community are changed by the causes I mentioned before, and your political compact inexplicit, your posterity will find that great power connected with ambition, luxury, and flattery will as readily produce a Caesar, Caligula, Nero, and Domitian in America as the same causes did in the Roman Empire. We're not somehow special. We're not somehow protected against tyranny and tyrants just because we live on an American soil. And that's the message that Cato was making here. And he says, therefore, a general presumption that rulers will govern well is not sufficient security. And I think Cato was thinking more long-term than Benjamin Franklin was. Benjamin Franklin is like, look, we can only do what we can do. We need to do something, and it will end in despotism, but let's get the ball rolling now. And Cato, I think, was thinking a little bigger picture here. And they weren't necessarily debating directly. And in fact, I don't even know if Cato would have known what Benjamin Franklin had to say that day. We're not certain of that. Going forward, he says, from that general presumption, this is because government power necessarily attracts what he called, quote, The unbridled ambition of a bad man. Power corrupts. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Power always seeks to grow. And though those areas where there is power, the worst of the worst will rise to the top. Oftentimes, the Federalists are saying, no, we've got the best, most moral society and the greatest people and all that stuff. And the best people are going to come to the top and do the right thing and follow the rules as they're supposed to. But he's like, no. Some of this stuff is really not well defined. And therefore, it's going to draw the unbridled ambition of a bad man. And we've had many bad men that were drawn to that power. Moving forward, he spends the rest of the paper discussing Congress, the structure of Congress, and also representation. He says this isn't real representation. It's only kind of a virtual representation, that it's impossible to have a pure representation of the people. And here from an interesting blog site called Last Best Hope on Earth, or Last Best Hope of Earth? No, on Earth. They put it this way: to protect against erosion of governmental institutions and the happiness of citizens, Cato counts on the legislative branch. Okay, the executive, we got to be concerned about this. Let's look at the legislative branch. At least if we have good representation, we can do something here. However, they write, for those institutions to succeed, they must have adequate representation so that citizens can have a direct influence on their government. Without that participation, there would be no opportunity to voice dissent should a strong leader occupy the presidency. They were always concerned about consolidation of power, a single point of failure. If we're talking more modern terms, in networking terms, if you have a single point of failure, if one person is making the decision or one computer is running everything, all you have to do is shut that off. We see that so often today with modern big tech companies. If one person can make the choice over who can do what, that's a very dangerous situation. And that's the same type of thing that Cato was talking about here. Many of the Anti-Federalists were talking about if you had one person with a lot of power, that's a dangerous scenario. If you've got a good person, maybe they'll do the right thing, but you can't rely on people being good. Patrick Henry talked about this specifically in the Virginia Ratifying Convention as well. So he had a lot of problems with Congress, and Tara Ross put it this way: he has a very long list of grievances about the composition and powers of Congress. Elections, I've got just to highlight a few of them. Elections should be once every year, not every 2 years. He dislikes the fact that Congress has so much power over the, quote, time, place, and manner of holding elections for the representatives. He thinks it is dangerous to give Congress the power to establish a standing army. He dislikes the fact that Congress lacks the power to abolish slavery. He also, surprisingly enough, doesn't like equal votes for the states in the Senate. He doesn't want pure equality, state, state, state. And he thinks the Senate is going to become more like a permanent aristocracy. I think he was right on part of that, maybe wrong on another part of it as well. And then he wraps it up talking about the lack of actual representation. And here's how Jason put it at Founder of the Day. The author finishes this paper by questioning why the total number of representatives are so few. And here's an interesting point. The inaugural election, Jason writes, the election of representatives for Congress was set up to include fewer members in the House than just the New York state government had at the time. So this was a very powerful message, and he's writing primarily to a New York audience here, debating with people like Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers. But he's saying, like, look, we're going to have less representation for all of these states than we have even in just our own state, and that can't be a good thing to build upon. Lowering the number of representatives, Jason writes, in a much larger government would only take power further away from individuals. And just a quick aside, I've often pointed out that if we're talking about if our goal is individual liberty, that is, if that's our goal, then the closer the decisions are made to the individual, the greater chance you have of having more individual liberty. And that's, I guess, what's kind of happening or being discussed here. Back to Jason. He says, lowering the number of representatives in a much larger government would only take power further away from individuals, making their ability to prevent tyranny significantly more difficult. And then he concludes this paper. He says, This is how he said, how can such a small number resist the influence of corruption and the temptation to treachery against which all governments ought to take precautions? In other words, corruption and treachery is going to happen in every single government, but you have a chance to reduce that by decentralizing a little bit more, a little less consolidation of power. And that's what Cato was warning about. And then he concludes the paper by pointing out that the question of the size of representation was actually covered 1 week earlier in an Anti-Federalist paper. And they didn't like calling themselves Anti-Federalists. I just should point that out again. Anti-Federalists thought of themselves as the true Federalists. They supported more federalism, and the Federalists were for more centralization, consolidation, far less than today. But these are terms of propaganda. But anyway, so he was pointing out right at the end that another guy named Brutus, and we actually have some evidence that maybe it was a sock puppet. John Williams was the same person writing both, but it could have been George Clinton. It could have been Melancton Smith. We don't know for sure. But he does point out, like, look, if we're talking about representation being too small, I'm not going to get into that right here. There is a much deeper, better paper on this just published last week, Brutus paper number 3. And he tells readers, he's like, basically, go read that if you want to learn more. I have a link up here that I will include in the show notes as well. Of course, I covered the entirety of all the Brutus papers like I'm doing now on Cato, Oppress and Plunder, Anti-Federalist Brutus number 3, which I did last May 28, 2021. That will be linked to in the show notes in case you want to do just what Cato was saying and learn what Brutus had to say about the lack of representation. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational. More important than anything, I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some time with me today. If you want to support what we're doing, nothing helps us get the job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Smashing the like button, adding review on Apple Podcasts, leaving comments on any of the video platforms, all that stuff will help spread the word, trigger algorithms, and tell them to show us to more people. I appreciate your help on that as well. Again, thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great weekend, and I'll see you next week on the path to liberty.